All right, so we've created our notes page, which is kind of the home page for our application as we've seen. So the next thing that we're going to create is going to be our note detail page. Now recall that when we set this page up in our routes, we used this URL parameter here to make sure that this page would be able to display different notes depending on which note the user had clicked. So, if the user clicks on this note, we'll see that that turns into 1, 2, 3. So what this page is going to have to do is find the note with that ID, if it exists, and display its details inside the page. So what that's going to look like, the first thing we're going to have to do in order to get the value of the URL parameter is we're going to need to import something called useParam. And this is a hook provided by the React Router DOM package that allows us to, as I said, get the value of URL parameters in React. So we'll say import useParams from React Router DOM. And the way that we're going to get the value of that parameter is by saying const params equals useParams. And the name of that param is the same name that we gave to it inside the route string, right? That's going to be note ID. And the way that we can do that is by saying const note ID equals params. And yes, we can condense this a little bit if we remove this and just put this useParams thing after this. We can remove the params variable like that and take care of that in one line. So we have the ID of the note. So the next question is, how do we actually get the array of notes so that we can find the note with this ID? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to allow this note detail page to take all of the notes as a prop. And essentially what it's going to do then is filter through those, find the note with this ID, and display its details. Now, this isn't the only way to do it, right? We could do the filtration logic inside the routes component if we wanted to, or as we're going to do later on, we could use context in our application. But for now, what we're going to do is just take this as a prop, since that's what we were doing in our notes page. So while we're thinking about it, let's go back to our routes component, and we're going to pass the notes prop to our note detail page, just like we did to our notes page here as well. So we'll say notes equals fake notes. And that should be it. All right, so the way that we're going to find the note with the matching ID now is by saying const note, and we're going to say equals notes.find, and we want to find the note whose ID is equal to the note ID URL parameter. All right, simple as that. We now have the note that matches. So the next thing we're going to do is inside this h1 heading, instead of displaying this as a note, which isn't super useful to be honest, what we're going to display instead is the note's title. So we'll say note.title. Under that, we'll say paragraph, and we'll display the note's content. For now, we're just going to display it as regular content, right? We're not going to render the markdown yet. We'll see how to do that later. And underneath that, what we're going to do is add a button which will allow us to edit the note. Now, we're going to look at how this will work a little later on. So for now, we're just kind of mocking out this page still. And then we have to wrap this in React fragments, since again, we're not allowed to return more than one top-level element from a React component. Cool, so let's see if this works the way we have it set up so far. What we should see is if we go back to notes 1, 2, 3, we should see the title of the note, which is my first note. We should see the content of the note, which contains markdown here that isn't being rendered still. And we have this edit button here. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do, and we're not going to carry this logic all the way through to the end yet, but what we're going to do inside this note detail page is we're going to add a state variable which will allow the user to enter and exit editing mode. So essentially, when the user is in editing mode, what that's going to look like is, as I said earlier, this is going to turn into a text input. This is going to turn into probably a text area. And this button will change into a save button. Okay? And that'll basically be how the user is allowed to edit the contents and title of each note. So in order to do that, what we're going to have to do is import the useState hook from React. So we'll say import useState from React. And down here, we're going to create a state variable called isEditing. Now what that's going to look like, we're just going to say const isEditing and set isEditing. And we're going to say equals useState, and the initial value for this is going to be false. Okay? because the user, when they first go to that page, is just going to want to view the note. They're not going to want to edit it unless they actually click that edit button. So what this edit button has to do now is we'll say onClick, and that's going to set the isEditing state variable to true. So when this button is clicked, we're going to say set isEditing to true. And now what we have to do is we have to take a look at this isEditing state variable when deciding what to actually display on this page. So essentially what that's going to look like, we're just going to say if isEditing, and we're going to define a completely different interface, completely different elements that will be returned from this component if the user is editing. Right? That's how we'll achieve the effect of switching between text inputs and just regular HTML elements. So if the user's editing, what the component is going to look like instead is we're going to say, first of all, we'll have to put this inside React fragments, just like we did down here. And we're going to display a text input with the note's title in it. So we'll say input. The value of this input is going to be the note's title. So we'll say note.title. And in the onChange, whenever this is changed, we're going to have to do something else, which I'll show you how to do shortly. For now, we're just going to put in an empty function there. Okay, and for the placeholder for this input, right, in case that's blank, we'll say enter a title. Now, under that, we're going to have the text area, which is where the user will be able to edit the note's content. And what that's going to look like is we're going to say placeholder, type your note here. For the value, we're going to display the note's content. And for onChange, we're just going to leave that as an empty function right now. We'll come back in a minute and I'll show you how that's actually going to work. All right, so we have our two inputs. The next thing we're going to add is the save button, which will basically do the inverse of this edit button. So what that's going to look like, we're just going to say button. The text of that button is going to be save changes. We're probably also going to want to have a cancel button here. We'll just say button. And this one will say cancel. And for now, these buttons are just going to do the same exact thing. They're just going to switch the isEditing variable back to false. So we'll say onClick. Let's try that again. There we go. OnClick equals set isEditing to false. And same thing for our save changes button. We're going to say onClick equals set isEditing to false. All right, so let's go have a look at how this page is going to work. If we click on edit now, what we'll see is that it changes these things to a text input and a text area, which are very ugly right now. They don't have any styling, right? That's something we'll add a little later on. But the point is that this works, right? We have these text inputs both correctly populated with the data that is in the note. So the next thing that we're going to do, and by the way, if you click on Save Changes or Cancel, that will take you back to the non-editing state of the note detail page. The next thing that we're going to do is see how to actually track the values, right? Track the changes that we have inside of here. Essentially, what we're going to have to do in order to allow ourselves to cancel, if we want to, is instead of modifying the actual content and title properties on this note here, which isn't something that you want to do in React because the DOM won't update correctly in that case, we're going to say const. And we're going to create two different state variables, which will keep track of the values inside the input and text area. So here's what those are going to look like. We're going to say const title value, or you know what, we'll say something like updated title and set updated title equals use state. The initial value of that is going to be the title value of this note, so we can say note.title. And if we want to provide a backup value for that, we can say or empty string. And then we'll do the same thing for our updated content. We'll say updated content and set updated content equals use state note.content or empty string. Okay, so now inside the input and text area that we have here, we just have to display updated title as the value. And on change, we're going to set that updated title state variable to whatever the current value in that input is. So we'll say e.target.value, and we'll have to do e inside the arguments for this onChange function. And then we're going to do the same thing for the content text area. We're going to say updated content just like that. And inside onChange, we're going to have to modify this function to say set updated content e.target.value. All right, so we now have two new state variables that will keep track of any changes we make to the input and text area. And the idea here, which we're not going to do quite yet, but I'll just draw out the skeleton of it, I suppose. The idea here is that we're going to have a function inside our note detail page called something like save changes. And what this is going to do is take the values of updated title and updated content and update whatever note this is to have those values instead. Okay. Now this is something that's going to be a little more complicated. We're going to have some kind of other prop function that we can call inside our note detail page to make that happen. But for now, we'll just say something like, we'll just display an alert saying saving changes, and we'll set the is editing back to false. So we'll say set is editing false. And then from our save button, what we're going to do is just say on click, save changes. And for our cancel button, in addition to setting is editing to false, we're going to have to reset the updated title and updated content values back to the notes title and content, okay? Since we decided we wanted to discard those changes. So what we're going to do there, we just have to say set is editing false, and above that we'll say set updated title to note.title, and set updated content to note.content. All right, so let's take a look at what this will do. We're going to come back here, click on Edit. We'll just change the title here and change the content here. If we click Save Changes now, we'll see the alert that says Saving Changes. And it's not actually going to persist those changes yet because we haven't added that logic. But the point here is that it will set those things to that correct value, right? If we click on Edit again, we'll see that those values are still there because they're persisted inside our component's state for the time being. On the other hand, if we click Cancel, right, if we want to get rid of those new values that we've added and just set that back to the original values on the note, we can see that if we go back now, it'll have the correct title and content from before. All right, so that's how that's all going to work. That's pretty much all of the logic we need to add for the time being to our note detail page. Oh, except there is one more thing, and that is we need to add some logic for dealing with the case where this note doesn't exist. Because currently, if we put in an ID of a note that doesn't exist and hit enter, we'll get an error because we haven't actually added any error handling logic to that case. So what this is going to look like is once we find our note from the notes array, we're going to have to add an if statement. And actually, let's add this down here underneath save changes. We're going to add an if statement that checks to make sure that that note exists and returns some kind of other page or other elements if it doesn't. So for that, we're just going to say if not note, right? If the note doesn't exist, we're going to return. And what we can return, there's a few things we can return. One thing to return would just be, you know, a basic error message. We could say something like, nope, that note doesn't exist, right? Something like that. But what I'm going to recommend you do is either display the not found page from our application. So you could say return not found page. Or even better, what you could do is create another not found page specifically for when a note isn't found by the ID, right? It kind of helps to have a different not found page for when a user is trying to access a specific instance of a resource than when the user just went to a page that no longer exists in our application. All right, so what I'm going to recommend you do, as I said, is create a new page, which we'll call the note not found page. And what we're going to do for that is just copy our not found page and change the text a little bit. So we'll change this one over to say something like, uh-oh, looks like that note no longer exists. All right, and then we don't have to add any other message here. We can just, we'll just display that message as the only thing for now. All right, so back on our note detail page, we could, instead of importing the not found page, we're going to import the note not found page and return that here. And now if we try and go to a page that doesn't exist, Oops. We're going to need to change the import path here as well. Note not found page. And if we refresh this now, we need to actually change the name of the component. This should be note not found page. Third time's a charm. Let's try refreshing this now. Oops. Okay, one more thing we have to do is we actually have to add a backup value if this note doesn't exist, right? We're already saying note.title, but if note doesn't exist, that's going to throw an error in JavaScript. So what we're going to do is say note and note.title. That'll make sure that the note exists before trying to access the title. And we'll say note and note.content as well, or empty string. All right, let's try this again. And sure enough, we see that it says, uh-oh, looks like that note no longer exists. So that's pretty much all we need to do for our note detail page. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.